class. As a reminder, as was mentioned during the service, there is no regular Sunday school next week because of the missions emphasis, and so we will be resuming 2 weeks from now. So you'll have to wait for 2 weeks to find out how to deal with the near sacrifice of Isaac, because that's coming up next time. So you just have an extra week to think about it. But feel free to read ahead in Genesis if you want to see what happens. So again, today we're going to be obviously continuing our look at the life of Abraham, and we're primarily going to be in Genesis chapters 20 and 21 are going to be our focus today. So Genesis 20 and 21. Last week we were in the previous 2 chapters, and we read about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the dialogue that God had with Abraham, where Abraham had said, you're not really going to destroy the righteous along with the wicked, are you? And Abraham, says, what if there's 50 righteous there? And God says, I'll spare it for 50. And then Abraham's doing the math in his head going, okay, I don't think Lot's that good an evangelist, so let's whittle the number down. And he whittles it down to 10, and there's not even 10 righteous people in Sodom. And then, of course, in chapter 19, we read about how Lot was literally dragged out of the city, and yet God spared him. He was a righteous man despite his many failings. And so that's what we focused on last week. So we looked at Abraham's negotiation with God and God's rescue of Lot from the city of Sodom. So, as I mentioned last week, that is the last that we hear of Lot in the narrative. He is referenced in the New Testament, as we saw, but as far as in the narrative in Genesis, we're done with Lot. He actually does not appear in the story anymore. So now we're shifting our focus exclusively to Abraham. And so if you have your Bibles, feel free to turn to Genesis chapter 20, and I'll read the first few verses from Genesis chapter 20. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech king of Gerar sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart, in the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart. And it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So you'll notice at the beginning of the chapter, it says that Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb. That's that area near Egypt, right on the border there. And it says he sojourned in Gerar. He continues to be a sojourner. And that's interesting because that's certainly not what we saw about Lot. Lot dwelled in the land. He dwelt in Sodom, but Abraham is a sojourner. And later on in today's lesson, we're going to look at some key passages in the book of Hebrews that draw attention to this fact, that, despite the promise that he was given, that God had given him, that this was going to be his land, he didn't see the full realization of that promise during his lifetime. He's a sojourner. Yes, he's wealthy, but he's still on other people's land. And that's, no matter how wealthy you are, there's a certain amount of uncertainty you will always have when you're on other people's territory. And we see in verse 2 that Abraham says of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. Now you might be thinking, okay, I've heard this before. This sounds awfully familiar, him claiming that Sarah is his sister. And yes, that does look familiar because he did this in Egypt many years earlier. The exact same stunt where he says, he's worried about himself. He's worried that, well, if they, that Sarah's beautiful, that if they find out that she's my wife, then they're going to kill me and take her. And now a couple things that arise from this. First of all, you might be wondering, if you're doing the math, you're sort of realizing, wait a second, Sarah's considerably older here than she was earlier. So how is it that Abraham would still be so worried about this? There's a few possibilities. One is that lifespans, by all accounts, are still longer in this time than they are now. We know this because Abraham himself lives to 175, which is far beyond our lifespans now. And so presumably then the aging wouldn't be as fast. And so, Sarah's 90 years old would be different from our 90 years old. And plus, she may just, and so it's entirely possible that she still, what would have been attractive in terms of, and appeared much younger than what we think of when we sort of think of the age of 90. And as well, what is also striking here is that Abraham, again, does the exact same thing. The exact same lie, says, she is my sister, and then Abimelech, the king of Gerar, takes Sarah and adds her to his harem. This is standard practice, where a king has a harem, and a harem just simply means you've got a bunch of wives/concubines. A concubine would be like one step below wife, and kings did this. It was common practice. And God appears to Abimelech in a dream and says, you're dead. You've got a man's wife in your harem, and that's unacceptable. And you'll notice that Abimelech's response is like, I'm innocent. I didn't know that that she was Abraham's wife. And you'll notice that God says, yes, I know you weren't intending to, but if you actually do have relations with her, now that you do know, you're going to be in serious trouble. So if you know what's good for you, you're going to let her go. Now, you'll notice that, yes, Abimelech says he's innocent. He is innocent in regards to the fact that he didn't know that Sarah was Abraham's wife. He's not as innocent in regards to, there's no indication he's a follower of, the true God. And, whatever time you live in, kings having harems obviously doesn't fit biblical moral standards. But that's not the focus of the narrative here. What is noticeable is that God intervenes to protect Sarah, and so that's why he appears to Abimelech in a dream. Now, verse 7 that we just read at the end here, it says, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet. That actually is the first time that the word prophet is used in the Bible. And what is a prophet? A prophet is someone who speaks on behalf of God. Now, when we think of prophets, we tend to think of the authors of some of the prophetic books like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. But Abraham, too, is a prophet because he spoke on God's behalf. So let's see how the story continues, going on to verse 8. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? Abraham said, I did it because I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. So you'll see that Abimelech, he's afraid, and so are the men with him. He calls the servants, and he says, I had a vision from God, and it turns out this Sarah is Abraham's wife, and God has told me, we're all dead if we don't return her right away. And so his response in verse 9 is quite understandable. He's ticked. He is not happy with Abraham. Why would he be? And so he says, what have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you brought this, this great sin upon me? And we talked about this a few weeks ago, and I think that this aspect comes through even more clearly here. Because you're probably noticing by now that we're reading this, you're kind of going, where's the condemnation of God to Abraham here? We see God talking very directly to Abimelech, like, what are you doing? Like, stop right now. But nowhere does God directly say to Abraham, you have sinned. And nowhere does the author, Moses here, editorialize and say, yeah, Abraham really goofed. And the reason it doesn't do that, at least my theory, is that there's no need to have that. It's obvious. The few things are more humbling than being rebuked by a non-believer. You know, when a non-believer, someone who does not follow God, points out that you're being hypocritical and says, like, what are you doing? You're a Christian. You say you do this, and yet I see you doing this. That's embarrassing. That is awkward. And I think that Abraham was really embarrassed there. And part of the reason that I think he's very embarrassed is that Abraham's response is classic defensiveness. I think he looks dumb, frankly, in terms of how he responds. And so verse 11, you see that, notice how Abraham responds. So Abimelech has challenged him, like, why did you do this? And Abraham says, I did it because I thought there was no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Okay, so there's the first part of Abraham's reasoning. There's no fear of God here, and so they're going to kill me. Now, you know what we just read earlier? Lots of fear of God. Like Abimelech, God appears to Abimelech in a dream, and he is panicked. He's freaked out. So Abraham is dead wrong on this point. There is a fear of God because God speaks to Abimelech, and Abimelech is like, "This is wrong. We've got to immediately change direction here." In fact, you know what's interesting? In this story, Abimelech shows more fear of God than Abraham does, and that's the ultimate rebuke. And Abraham's not done with his self-justification. Verse 12, here's where this gets really kind of interesting. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. I didn't technically lie. You know, it's like, it's your fault for thinking. I didn't say technically that, that she's not my wife, that she's my wife, yes. I just said she's my sister, and technically she is my half-sister. We've got, the daughter of so we've got the same father, but different mothers. So Abimelech, like, maybe you should have asked more questions. Again, it's weak. This is a classic example of the half-truth that's meant to mislead. And these are lies. It's a lie. He's lying. I mean, when he says she's my sister, and the explicit context is that Abimelech is asking because he wants to know if she's his wife, and he says she's my sister. He is lying. These kind of half truths or half lies. We do these now. These are common in politics. Not the current MP, but other politicians do this. Well, it's municipal politics is much cleaner than all than this federal stuff. But yes, this half-lie thing, it's a common thing that we do, and you see Abraham doing it quite clearly here, because it's pretty bad. And then that's not all. Notice verse 13, because he's really piling it on here. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, "This is the kindness you must do me at every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother." See, now he's in a sense, trying to throw God under the bus. When God caused me to wander, sort of I would have just stayed in Ur. I was doing just fine. But when God caused me to wander, like I said to Sarah, this is what you have to do. Again, it's so similar to what you see Adam and Eve do when they get confronted with their sin, where they do remember when Adam says, "The woman you gave me, she gave me the fruit, and then I ate." Like, God, it's actually kind of your fault. And so you put this all together, Abraham does not come out terribly well here. And no, the story doesn't explicitly say that, but it's obvious. I think sometimes the rebuke is more powerful when you don't include it directly in the text, and the reader can just read this and go, yeah, we've got ungodly Abimelech and godly Abraham. An ungodly Abimelech comes out of this looking really good, and Abraham looking like, whoa, you've got some issues here. Next few verses, and then we'll open up for some discussion. Verse 14. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham. and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you. To Sarah he said, Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Notice the lengths that Abimelech is going through to make restitution. He's generously giving. He's making Abraham even wealthier than he was before. He's giving like oxen and sheep and servants over to Abraham. Returns Sarah and says to Abraham, you can live anywhere you want. My land is before you. And then to Sarah, he's sort of saying, I've given your brother. It's kind of interesting that he doesn't say husband there. I don't know if he's kind of poking a little bit there, like your technical half-brother / husband. Anyway, I've given him 1,000 pieces of silver. It's a sign of your innocence. And then it says Abraham prays to God. And so Abimelech is wanting to, and by the way, 1,000 pieces of silver, that's an enormous sum. The commentaries point out that that's a lot of money. This is not a token amount. It's a huge amount. He's really trying to make amends for his error. And then we see in verse 18 that the Lord had closed the wombs of the house of Abimelech. And so there were consequences for the house of Abimelech that, yes, even though he didn't know until God revealed to him who Sarah was, there is still, the impact that the whole household was experiencing. And again, the story doesn't have any direct rebuke of Abraham. I think the rebuke is implied. But again, you can sort of come to your own determination. I will say I have not found a commentator yet who tries to argue that Abraham did nothing wrong here. Pretty much every commentary that I've checked basically lays it on as far as, the rebuke is implied. It's obvious. It didn't have to be explicitly stated. So I'll pause there for a moment, open up to any comments and questions. Okay, then we're good. Then I will go to the next chapter here. So we're in Genesis 21, starting with the first few verses. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. God keeps his promise. It says the Lord visited Sarah, as he had said. This is similar to when you see the phrase God remembered. Doesn't mean that God forgot. It means that when you see the phrase God remembered, it's always a way of saying God took action. And so you can look at this similarly here. When it says he visited, he's always with Sarah, of course, but he's taking action here. And Sarah conceives. And now Abraham was 100 years old at this time. We know that Sarah's 10 years younger, so she's 90. That's pretty old, even for that time. That is rather old to have a child. And they name their son Isaac. That's what God told them to name him. And Isaac simply means he laughs. And so that's why you see the reference to laughter here. And it's meant in a positive way. Laughing out of joy is what is being referenced. You'll notice that in verse 4 that Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he's 8 days old. This is that circumcision command that was given in Genesis chapter 17 to Abraham and all of his male descendants, that they are to be circumcised either at 8 days old after they're born, if they're born into the faith, or you get circumcised if you convert and you join the Israelites. and that could be as an adult. So obviously, if you have your choice, get it done when you're 8 days old. So Isaac is circumcised at the age of 8 days. I'm going on to verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So there is a feast that happens, as we see in verse 8, and it says that it took place when he was weaned. That's generally that was around, it would have been around ages 2 or 3. So Isaac would have been still very young at this point. And in verse 9, it's an interesting phrase. So the son of Hagar, this is Ishmael, by the way, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, laughing. And some Bibles will have a footnote, mine does, where it says possibly laughing in mockery. It's a little unclear what's being referenced here. Most commentators tend to say that it is likely that this is sort of making fun of, derision, sort of. There are some who sort of suggest that there's some kind of, that this hints at some kind of possible where he's hurting him in some way, abusing him in some way. Most say, however, more likely it's that it's mockery which is happening. But regardless, this is obviously a problem. Ishmael is Abraham's oldest son. Now, under the custom of the time in the ancient Near East, the inheritance of the father's title and a double portion of land goes to the oldest son. That is standard practice in the ancient Near East. The eldest son inherits the birthright, which means extra land, extra responsibilities, the family name in terms of being in charge of that. All of that goes to the oldest. Now, for those of you who know your Bibles, you know that God is totally fine with overriding that one. In fact, there seem to be more cases where the younger seems to always be taking the lead. But keep in mind the context at the time, that you've got this teenage boy, because he would have been a teenager at this point, mocking 2 or 3-year-old Isaac, and Sarah sees this, and she's like, "We've got a problem." And she says, "We need to send Ishmael and Hagar away." Abraham doesn't want to do this. He loves his son. In fact, you remember in chapter 17, when God was saying, "You're going to have a son through Sarah," and Abraham's like, "Yeah, that's not likely, but Ishmael, may he live before you." Remember, Abraham, when Ishmael was born, Abraham thought, problem solved, I helped God out here, we got a son, we're good, no need to worry. But God's like, nope, it's actually going to be through Sarah that this promise is going to continue. And so it seems harsh at first glance, where you see Sarah saying, "Cast them out," and then Abraham doesn't want to, and then God's saying, do what Sarah says. Now, there's a few things to take note of here. First of all, God does not disregard the human factor of Ishmael and Hagar. We'll see that very clearly in the next little bit we're going to read. So for those who are thinking, if you at first glance that, boy, God he doesn't care about anyone who's not part of this promised line, not the case. He cares very much. But secondly, again, considering the cultural context at the time, it actually would have been problematic if Ishmael remained in the household, because you've got this older son by a significant amount that by all legal rights would be heir to the birthright and all of that, and then him possibly challenging Isaac for that birthright, who knows? And so God wants to make sure that there's no doubt that Isaac is the chosen one, The reality is they could not grow up together because God did not want there to be any confusion over who would be the son of promise. This is too important to have the risk of, well, yes, God, it seems that God did say it was Isaac, but boy, Ishmael, he actually seems pretty good, and he was the firstborn, so maybe he should be. And I think what a significant part of what is happening here is that God is ensuring that no, there is no dispute over who the chosen one is. And so, as a result, Abraham obeys God's voice, gives some supplies to Hagar, and sends her away. How that conversation went, I don't know. Probably not great. But that's what happens. I'll read the next part, and then we'll open up to some comments and questions in just a little bit here. Verse 15. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bowshot, for she said, "Let me not look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. And he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So we see that Hagar and Ishmael, they after they're gone for a while, they've run out of water, they've run out of supplies, and Hagar, basically is like she is despondent. They're at the end of the rope. He's going to die, and she's like, I do not want to see my child die. And God intervenes. It says, the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. And again, the angel of God, I believe, a lot of commentators would agree with me on this, that this is sort of a way of saying that God himself is speaking. But there are some who would argue that it was an angel and God appointed to speak whatever God is speaking. So however you want to sort of interpret that. In any case, we see that God cares about Ishmael. And God provides water for them and provides a promise saying that this boy, Ishmael, is going to be the father of a great nation. No, he's not the son of promise. That is for Isaac. But he's going to be the father of a great nation. And so this, you see early here in Genesis, multiple times, that yes, God's focus from Genesis 12 on is on the Jewish people, but that doesn't mean God doesn't care about non-Jews. He cares very much. He cares about everyone. Having Abraham be a blessing to the whole world includes people who are not Jewish. And so Hagar and Ishmael, God intervenes to save them, to protect them. And by the way, it's believed that Ishmael is the ancestor of many of the modern-day Arabs. So that's sort of the historical tradition, that Ishmael is the ancestor of Arabs. Now, an interesting fact for you, and some of you will know this and some of you may not, but in my world religions class that I teach at school, when we get to Islam, I explain to students that there's a lot of points of similarity between Islam and Christianity, but there are also some differences. So when you read the Quran, and the Quran reads very differently from the Bible. I mean, get yourself an English translation and take a look through it. You'll see what I mean. It has a very different tone. But what is interesting about the Quran is it actually retells in a sort of a different kind of way some of the key stories in the Bible, but with some differences. So in the Quran, Ishmael is the son of promise, not Isaac. And so Ishmael is actually the chosen one rather than Isaac. Next 2 weeks from now, when we look at the near sacrifice of Isaac, according to Quran, it was Ishmael that Abraham almost sacrificed. So in Islam, the focus is on Ishmael. Judaism and Christianity puts the focus on Isaac. And if you're wondering, well, how does that work? Where the Bible is very clear that the focus is on Isaac. Muslims believe that the Quran that the Bible has translation mistakes that have crept in and all that, but the Quran has no errors in it. So if the Quran and the Bible contradict, they go with the Quran. But I thought you'd find that interesting, just that emphasis in the Islamic faith on Ishmael. Just before I open up to some comments and questions, I want to turn to Galatians chapter 4, because this story referencing Hagar and Ishmael is actually used by the Apostle Paul to make a theological point many years later. So I'm going to go to Galatians chapter 4, verse 21. Now, the book of Galatians is a letter that Paul writes to the churches in Galatia, basically saying to them, you guys have lost the plot here. You've turned to legalism. You're focused on bringing all the laws in from the Old Testament, and you don't need to do all that stuff. And so Paul writes, and he's quite exasperated. Like it's, in Galatians 3, he says, "Oh, foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" Like he's ticked, he's upset. And so Paul is sort of pulling at all the stops and saying, stop focusing on the law. That's not the point here. What you're doing is you're making it harder for people to come to faith. So in the middle of chapter 4, after he's been really emphasizing this point about, you observe days and months and seasons and years, I may have labored over you in vain. So now in verse 21 of Galatians 4, he references this familiar story. So now I'm going to read it. "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave woman was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, 'Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband.' Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as that time he was born according to the flesh, persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman." So Paul, remember the context in Galatians, Paul is making a theological point, and he's struggling with these Galatians. Like they're trying to turn back to the law and get all legalistic, and Paul is pulling at all the stops. And then he says, okay, maybe you'll get this point. And he says, remember the free woman and the slave woman, Sarah and Hagar, and they all would have known. Remember, Paul is referencing, Genesis is in the Torah. This is the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. These are the most important scriptures in Judaism. And so Paul says, you're going to know this story. So you got the slave woman and the free woman. Very important to note in verse 24, he says, now these may be interpreted allegorically. What is he saying by allegorically? He's saying, I'm going to make a theological point here, and this theological point is not commenting on whether Hagar is a good person. Okay, so, because when you read this in the abstract, it kind of looks at first glance like, boy, he's really dumping in Hagar here. Like, oh, just this slave woman, and boy, this is a terrible, terrible person. That's not what he's saying. He is saying, I'm going to make a point here, because he's talking about the law is slavery, but in Christ is freedom. And so he says, remember Hagar, the slave woman, and her son, and you got Isaac, who's born from Sarah, the free woman, and that's the son of promise. And so Abraham is saying, you should be associated with Isaac, the son of the free woman, rather than Ishmael, the son of the slave woman, in an allegorical sense. He's not commenting on Arab people. He's not even criticizing Ishmael and Hagar. He's rather making a theological point. And you'll notice that he's writing to Jewish Christians who keep trying to go back to the law. And so he's saying to them, if you guys really are faithful to your Judaism, then you actually would be seeing my point here that you don't want to be under slavery. That think of Mount Sinai where the Ten Commandments come. Think that's like the present Jerusalem in slavery with her children. They're in slavery to the law because the law doesn't free you of sin. The law exposes sin. For those of you that have read The Pilgrim's Progress, when Christian went to the interpreter's house and there's this one key scene that's presented, and you have the guy, the room is really dusty, and the guy comes along and starts sweeping, and then it just makes everything worse. Everyone's just choking on the dust, and the interpreter says, see, that's the law. That's all the law can do. It'll expose it. Like, you've got all your sin all around here, and you just sweep using the law, and it exposes it, and actually it doesn't fix the problem. And so you need to actually fix the problem. And so what Paul is doing is he's taking a well-known story from Genesis, from these chapters in Genesis. Everyone would have known about Hagar and Sarah, and then he makes a theological point. So he's not criticizing Hagar herself, per se. He's rather saying that if you really consider yourselves descendants of Isaac, the son of promise, well then, shouldn't you be on the side of being free? And we're not under bondage. This is the whole point in Galatians. And again, after this, go read the book of Galatians, and you'll see that's the context. I mean, and this is just on a slight segue here, not too much, but slight segue. There are Christians today that it's common, like in terms of going into legalism and getting into we got to follow the feasts, and we got to do this and we got to do that, and I don't know how you can read Galatians and still think you got to do all that stuff. If you want to celebrate those, great, go ahead. You can do all the feasts you want. If that sort of enlivens your spiritual life, great. But this idea that you have to, no. Similarly, like if you choose to get circumcised or have your children circumcised, fine. So there's reasonable health reasons why you would choose to do that. But it's got nothing to do with God in terms of what's important now. And so that's why in Galatians chapter 5, the very first verse says, "For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery." So as Christians, we are free. So we shouldn't be sort of imposing rules that God himself doesn't impose on us anymore. So if you're reading through the Torah and you're getting from it that, hey, we got to follow all these laws, you're missing the point. And that's what Paul is doing here. He's saying, actually, read your Torah, and you can actually see a deeper message already. Anyway, that was a bit of a segue, but I think it relates to the point here because Paul drew the connection, so I'm just expanding on it. I'll pause there. Comments and questions? Nothing, even on all that? It needs time to digest. Fair enough. Hopefully you don't have indigestion over the next week, so don't want that. Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, there are some people I know they're kind of falling into this Hebrew roots movement,
Right.
which is, as you mentioned, largely about legalism and such. And as being different, set apart from that, I actually say it's not just about the 600-700 laws of the Old Testament. It's about more, the billions of laws of the Holy Spirit living in our hearts.
Yeah.
Convicting us as we live.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, it's as Jesus quite often used to say, not just that, but more, I tell you.
Good. Yeah. No, very good point. And just the reference here to the Hebrew roots movement, yes, I do know about it, and I know that there are a lot of people that are influenced by it. And again, you can be a good Christian and take elements of that, but you also can get yourself into a lot of area that you really shouldn't have to go to, where you start putting burdens on yourself and significantly on other people when you start sort of turning those feasts into things everyone has to do. And this is where, for example, you get into the whole Sabbath debate, and among Christians, there's a lot of debate around that. When you look at the New Testament, and Jesus never, when he says that the law has not passed away, that's true. The law has not passed away, and he's asked, what's the greatest of the commandments? He says, well, you should know it. It's in Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. I mean, it's And he didn't give the scriptural reference because they all would have known it, because that verse he was quoting was actually the parchment that every Jew put in their little mezuzah, that little box on the front of their house. So it was an implicit rebuke to the Jewish teacher of the law when he asked Jesus the question. He says, "Here's the greatest commandment," and the teacher of the law would immediately have realized, "Oh yeah, I've got that in my mezuzah. That's the greatest commandment. Maybe I should have known that already." And then of course the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. If you really think it through, those are actually much harder to keep than all the other stuff. Like in terms of love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, that's really tough. That's actually much harder. If you do that, you've actually done everything else. Everything else. Because if you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, you're probably not going to go around committing adultery. You're not going to be doing any murder. You're not going to be worshiping idols. You're not going to be using God's name in vain. You're just going to naturally be following God. And the whole idea as a Christian is that the Holy Spirit indwells in us, and we should naturally be following God. Like this is, but as humans, we create rules and all that. And then the problem with the rules, and the rules come from a good place. We're trying to put guardrails so that way people don't fall into temptation and sin and all that. But what often will happen is that you turn the rule into the focus. And so, and I see this as school. This is as a teacher in school, like this is so common. You put the rule in, and if you don't word it properly, the students know exactly how to go right up to the edge of that rule. They're technically not breaking it, but they're just that close. And it's like they know that wasn't the spirit of what you said, but it technically complies. We do that. I mean, this is just our natural human tendencies. Whatever the rule is, we just kind of skirt right up into the edge. And that's why a focus on the rules is not the way to go. Because sin, it seizes the opportunity from the commandment. That's sort of how Paul phrases it in Romans. And so the law doesn't fix anything. It exposes the problem. So yeah. Okay, I will go on to verse 22, where the narrative continues. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, "God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not dwell falsely with me or with my descendants or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will dwell with me and with the land where you have sojourned." And Abraham said, "I will swear." So you'll notice that Abimelech, by all accounts, he seems so far to be a pretty decent guy as far as pagan kings go. Where he immediately responds when God rebukes him. And now he's like, Abraham, I may still be kind of ticked over that whole half lie you told me, but I want to be on good terms with you. So please promise me that you will not deal falsely with me or with my descendants, but I've dealt kindly with you, so please basically be nice to me in this land where you have sojourned. And Abraham agrees to do so. And I think that you see an indication here of, this is just one of those early indicators of Abraham's a blessing. Despite Abraham's weaknesses as a human, you see that God's name is expanding here. Where Abimelech and the people around him, they're starting to hear about the true God. That God's name is being heard. It is being understood. Now we go on to verse 25. When Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, "I do not know who has done this thing, and you did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today." So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart?" He said, "These 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well." Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. So we see that there is a dispute over the wells, a well of water that some of Abimelech's servants had seized. And And you'll notice that Abimelech says, like, again, I didn't know about this. I didn't know who's done it. Abraham, you didn't tell me. I've not heard it until today. So it's an interesting dynamic that they have here where, Abraham is reproving Abimelech, and Abimelech is saying, yeah, okay, this has kind of happened before where I didn't really know, and I'm only finding out about this now. But regardless, the two of them make a covenant, and they make an agreement that they are able to dwell together in peace. And so now I do want to point something out here, because you see in the reference here to Philistines. There's a bit of a historical challenge here. I'll just lay it out. That other historical works, the Philistines don't come onto the historical record until about 600 years after Abraham. That's sort of the earliest that they appeared. I believe that was in some Egyptian writings that they get referenced. So is the Bible wrong here? No, I don't believe that it is. There's a couple of possibilities. The one that sort of seems the most plausible that some commentators point out is that these could very well be the forerunners of the Philistines, like sort of the ancestors of the Philistines that the Philistines come out of. And again, Moses, who is believed to be the author or editor in this case, is compiling this many years later, and he's using terminology that would have been understood to the people at his time of writing, and so he describes them as the Philistines, even if this is the group that precedes the Philistines. So, I don't know, that seems reasonable to me. I mean, it would be like sort of referring to, nowadays you're writing a historical account of a particular nation, and you're describing it as that nation's land, even though technically didn't have the land at the time, but just for the sake of people understanding, you just use that name. Now, in verse 34, it says that Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. What should be noticeable by now is that Abraham, despite all of his wealth, he's living a pretty nomadic life. He's a sojourner. He never really does truly settle down. And in that context, I want to go to Hebrews chapter 11. And I want to read an excerpt from the famous Heroes of Faith chapter. And I want you to sort of get the impact of how much deeper the significance is of the story of Abraham when we've now sort of looked at some key elements of his life in some detail. And now I'm going to read how the author of Hebrews summarizes. So I'm going to go to Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 to 16. Verses 8 to 16. I won't go to 17 yet because there it's referencing things that happen in the next chapter in Genesis. But the first part here. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly ones. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. When you read that passage and you keep in mind what we've just looked at in some detail about Abraham's life, I think it's got more power to it, because it really is amazing. Abraham obeyed. He was in a place of comfort, the city of Ur originally and then Haran, two cities that things are going pretty well, and Abraham is told to go to this place. He doesn't know where he's going. And as we see in verse 9, that he's living in this land of promise, but as in a foreign land. That's why in Genesis you see again and again, Abraham sojourned. He's sojourned. He's not even settled down. Why would he do this? He was looking forward to the city without foundations, that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. He had faith. Was he perfect? No, he was severely imperfect. We've seen this. I pointed this out. But he still believed. And how do we know that he believed? Because in the end, he ultimately did it. So we're not saved by works. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. It was totally the faith that saved him, not his works. But because his faith was real, it led to works. So I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be reading this. It wouldn't be the same story here if it said Abraham believed, but then he did nothing. Well, no, then he didn't actually believe. Faith implies, it means that you're actually willing to do something as a result of what you believe. Notice the reference to Sarah here, that she received power to conceive, even though she was past the age, that this would normally happen. And so Sarah had faith. Yes, we see in the text in Genesis that she laughed to herself. Who wouldn't if when you're like 90 years old and you're told that you're going to have a son? But she still believed. She still had faith. She followed Abraham. She trusted in Abraham's God. And, the reference to this one man, Abraham, is good as dead. In other words, like 100-year-old men, they're not producing babies. But Abraham was. And they all die in faith, as the author says here, but they know they're strangers and exiles on the earth. They're seeking a homeland, and ultimately it's a heavenly one. And so the story of Abraham, it's powerful because it is truly a great example of faith. And I really like the fact that his foibles are left in the story because it's comfort to us that, faith in God doesn't mean we don't stumble along the way. It simply means that we trust and then we obey, we do things. And we don't, just because we make a mistake, and sometimes a really big one, that doesn't mean that, okay, all that stuff, they actually had no faith. No, that doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means that you made a mistake. So I'll open up to some comments and questions in a second here. 2 points of application that I would suggest that stand out to me. One, going back to Abraham and Abimelech, always be mindful of your witness to non-Christians, to unbelievers. They're watching us. They really are. And especially if they know you're a Christian, they're in many cases they know how we're supposed to live and what the expectations are. So just think that through into whatever context you're in, that that event that you're at or whatever, and you're hanging out with some non-Christian colleagues and all that. Consider your language. Consider what kind of witness am I giving, because we are being watched, and they notice when we're being hypocritical. Abraham got called out on it, and I think he was embarrassed. I know I've been called out where I've fallen short, and it's most embarrassing when it's a non-Christian that does it, where it's like, I got really nothing here. This is embarrassing. And then a second point of application, just referencing with Hagar and Ishmael, is that we need to remember God cares for everyone, even if we don't know where they fit in the plan. Ishmael and Hagar, where do they fit? Well, God had a place for them, and it was not immediately apparent at the time when they were sent away. But God cared for them just as he cared for Isaac and for Abraham. So we just got a couple of minutes left. I will open it up to comments and questions. Yeah, so like the comment is sort of like that maybe Abraham was told it was wandering around, and then this was a way of sort of expanding his witness and God's name. That's entirely possible because we actually see that happening, and because at first glance it might be the story would be so much simpler if Abraham was just called, go to this land, boom, here's your nation, there you go, done, and you've settled down. But instead, it's a meandering kind of path. We see this, it's actually a common theme in the Bible. Things seem to meander. Even if you look at church history over the last 2,000 years, there's some serious meandering going on. But with the benefit of hindsight that we have, we can actually see how that early church, with starting just the few scared people in the beginning, changed the planet, changed the world. Jesus promised that this would happen. And in fact, as the phrase, as some of the Christians were described in Acts 17 or 18, when there was some dispute, when the authorities were worried about them, and they referred to these men who have turned the world upside down. This is what our faith does. It turns the world upside down. Not all at once, but over time. Abraham turned the world upside down. Even if in his context in that time, he probably didn't feel like it. I'm sure there were plenty of times he's wandering around going like, why am I doing this? Like I don't even have my own territory. I'm rich, I've got lots of stuff, but I'm moving around a lot. So yeah, good comment. Other comments or questions? Yep. Mm. Yep. Yep. Mm. Yep. Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. The fact that God would speak directly to Abimelech, who by all accounts is not a godly king, and does not do the same vision to Abraham. I think it has more power in terms of doing it this way. It's a strong. I would suggest it's a stronger rebuke that when God speaks to this king who does not know God and says, "Okay, we got a problem here. This is what you're going to have to do." And he doesn't speak to, even though Abraham is the prophet. Abraham is the one who speaks for God, and yet in this case here, God doesn't speak to his prophet. He speaks to the ungodly king and says, like, you've got to make restitution here. You've got a problem. So it is, again, I think it shows, one, that God cares for everyone, including non-believers, and that God doesn't just randomly punish people for things that they've done with the integrity of their own heart. But also it shows that don't take your relationship with God for granted either, that it's not a free pass to then just sort of, well, who really cares about the problem that I put this unbeliever in? Because this was significant here in terms of what happened. Yep. Mm. Yep. Yep. Mm. Mm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yep. Mm. Mm. Yep. Mm. Yeah, no, some very interesting points. Certainly, yes, in terms of, it is kind of ironic that Abraham, in terms of his actions, actually, certainly in these two chapters, isn't doing things that are a blessing to the people around. He's kind of messing stuff up. Fortunately, it's God who says, God says, I will make you a blessing. And the implied thing here is, even though you're going to mess up, I'm going to make you a blessing. This is still going to happen. And God is going to keep his covenant. And so, with your comment about it's not, the focus isn't on a state, it's a process, like in a promise. I would argue that there's both here. This is my Zionist leaning here, that there's both a state and also a process and a promise that is carried out. I think that it can be both and in this case. But some very good points, some good observations. And as far as the structure of the text, yes, one of the areas that I'm weaker in terms of my ELA was never my favorite subject in school, where you map out sort of these different, and commentators do point out that in these narratives, you often have what's called a chiasm structure. And yes, the commentaries will often point these out, and they're interesting, but I've just never been that good at that kind of stuff, so I have to be honest, I just don't really focus on that a whole lot. But yes, go to some of the good commentaries, and they'll actually point this out, and it actually makes the narrative just that much stronger. And like if I were a better teacher in some of this, I'd be sort of bringing that in, but I'm just not that good at that kind of mapping out poems or the narrative in that way. It's just never been my strength. So I appreciate you bringing that up because you're absolutely right. The chiasm, that kind of structure where it kind of, and I think it adds to the credibility of the strength of the text being inspired by God, because it's amazing how well the stuff sort of interlocks and weaves in when you study that in Bible school. I know some of the classes I took in some of the courses I did sort of focused on this, but not my area of strength, so that's why I don't make a lot of references to that. But maybe I should try to at least mention it once in a while. So some good comments. Okay, we're past 12. I'm going to have to stop. I will quickly close with prayer, and then we're dismissed. Heavenly Father, Lord, I just thank you that you've given us your inspired word that we can study. And Lord, it's just amazing we see that how Abraham failed again and again, and yet you worked through him and you made him a blessing to the people around him, even though Abraham's actions often didn't. And Lord, I just ask that you would help us to be a blessing to the non-Christians around us, and that you would strengthen our witness and our character so that we could be a positive example to those in our circles. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.